On this episode of CPR Ford Garage, the short block is together. Ooh, shiny. So sorry this is taking so long to come out. Ended up being a lot more footage than I think I've had so far. Anyway, assembling an engine is a pretty intensive process. So the way this is going to go is I'm going to cover the assembly of the short block. I'll show you basically checking clearances on the crankshaft, installing the crankshaft, checking clearances on the rod bearings and pistons, and installing those. Now, what I do is show you one and then just kind of gloss over the rest of them so that you get the gist of it. Now, I don't go real heavy into specs and clearances, and that's because depending on what you're doing with your engine, they will vary. So this is basically rebuilt to the specs of about a stock short block, which is what I want for my purpose. If you're doing something else, then you need to vary from there. Things like the bearing clearance and the piston ring clearance might be a little too tight if you're going to do something like spin a lot of RPM or use nitrous or turbocharger, supercharger. You want to open up the ring gaps for that. I have no plans for this to do that at this time. This is just a basic stock bottom end, naturally aspirated engine that's going to have goodies bolted on top of it as you would to just a stock short block that you pulled out of a running truck or something like that. So I'll warn you, it did get a little bit long, but I didn't want to leave any other stuff out. I'm trying to cover the basics here for a basic engine build for somebody that if they were thinking about doing this, maybe they could watch my video and it would help them out enough to where they feel confident doing this themselves. And this is from a DIY shade tree mechanic standpoint. I'm not a professional engine builder. I'm just a guy who does this as a hobby and has assembled several Ford engines. The next engine episode is going to cover everything about the heads. Also, it is now 2020. Happy New Year. We have picked up a new project for the new year. There will be an episode coming out on that soon within the next couple of weeks. So I will give you a little sneak peek of that at the end of the episode, so stay tuned till the end for that. So I don't know if you can see that good enough there. I'll try to line up some lobes toward the bottom. But looking at them, you can't really tell a whole lot of difference by looking. The lobes are definitely taller if you look at them in relation to the cam journal where it rides in the bearing. So yeah, there you go. Old versus new. I'm going to clean it off and I'm going to show you a trick for putting it in. Okay. This might be a little difficult to see, but basically I have the rear half of the cam lobes and journals all sauced up with this really sticky lube, which is even kind of overkill since this cam is already broken in. But the trick here is they make a nice handle that bolts onto the end of this, so when you're putting the cam in you don't nick the bearings. Don't have that here. So if you put the cam in first before you put the crank in, you can actually reach down through where the main journals are and kind of guide it in there. So just real slow and easy. I'll get this hand in. This lube is kind of thick, so it's pretty normal to have to give it a little twist as you go. But you should never have to hit it or hammer it at all. It should just go totally that smooth. Now I need to finish saucing up the rest of it. So here's my homemade parts washer. Rubbermaid tote from Lowe's. And 2 gallons of low odor mineral spirits. And they're not BSing you with the low odor, hey? I can't really smell it until I'm scrubbing. I got the main caps and bolts in there right now. I already cleaned the crankshaft about 3 times in that tote, scrubbed it with mineral spirits. Blew it out with air, scrubbed it with brake cleaner, hosed it down, wiped it off. And what you want to do is make sure all these oil passages are clear and through. This is the oil feed for the connecting rods that comes from the main bearings. So this passage should go through from there into here. Sometimes you get a reman crank from a crank remanufacturer and they don't drill those holes all through after welding them for the repairs. So you don't really want a crank that's been welded on anyway, and you need to make sure these are chamfered also. There should be a little chamfer around them because that's how the oil gets in there with the tight clearance. Okay, that's main bearings all laid in there. There's a groove in the main boss that the tang goes into, and obviously don't put the thrust bearing in the wrong place. That is the middle one. You can tell that's where it goes because there's a groove cut out to fit around this shoulder. They're all pressed in, dry for now. We'll lay the crank in there and check some clearances. They make these idiot proof, you can see. They're all numbered and give you the direction they go in. But I was always told if you make something idiot proof, the world will build a better idiot. So you can see how it's a little tricky to do this one-handed, but got to get the tang in there and then just make sure it's pushed down so that it's flush on both sides. Okay, so here is the Cleveite plastic gauge, and we are on the 1,000th to 3,000th range. We'll start with that. So what you do is cut off a piece about yay, and there's a little green rod inside of there. We'll actually peel this one open. This is what it is. Basically, it's a certain diameter plastic, and you need some good sharp scissors or a sharp pocket knife to cut it with. We will cut little pieces. They go on each one of the bearing journals. We put the caps on, torque them down, and then take the caps back off and measure how much they crushed. Now, this is not a substitute for dial indicators, micrometers, all of that stuff. But we're not machining things, we're not making tolerances, we're just checking to make sure that no parts are wrong and that the machine work was done correctly. So I'll show you one real quick here, and then we will do the rest of them and check them all. Carefully, I put it about straight up at 12 o'clock and try to get it as straight as I can. Okay, there we go. Sometimes if they don't want to stay, you can kind of use the oil from your finger to kind of roll and make it stick a little bit until you get the cap on. You set it on there, and grab your loaded up, ready to go bearing cap. Number 1. Arrow goes towards front. Set it on there. This is hard to do while I'm looking through the phone here. Okay, so now I've torqued all of the main cap bolts to 105 foot-pounds. And there is our plastic gauge. And then we go ahead and lay our gauge on there. If I can get my thumb off of there. We go ahead and lay our gauge on there. It's kind of hard to hold it straight and look through the camera. But if you look, number 1 main bearing clearance is at 2 thousandths. So we will write everything down in our book. 2 thousandths is good for a street engine that's not going to rev real high and you want to last a long time. If you're going to be revving it pretty high, you want looser than that, more like 2.5 or 3 thousandths. This is slightly looser than stock. Stock would be like between 1.5 and 2 thousandths, I believe. So there's the plastic gauge you can see on the bearing shell. It is supposed to just dissolve inside of the engine, but I'll show you what I do, and that's just take my fingernail and scrape it off, and I'll do that on the crank as well. And then I just clean that up with a paper towel before I put lube on it and put it back together. Okay, rear main seal goes in. It's a 2-piece, and this tab goes out. You can see the lip on the back there, where there's a kind of a U channel that goes to the inside of the engine. And they say to always offset the seal so that where the two halves meet is not at the parting line of the bearing. So, like so, little dab of sealer on both ends where the two seal halves meet, but I'll go ahead and take care of that on the cap end. Also, you do put a small and tiny bead of high pressure silicone right here where this cap goes in, otherwise it will weep oil out of there. So little tiny bead this way, just the tiniest smear. You have to make sure that that cap seats down flush when you put it in the final time. So we'll get a little lube on these bearings and the rear main seal and go ahead and plop the crank back in. Here comes the 85-pound crankshaft for the last time. Okay. Hey, my lower back. Just ease it on in there. And there you go. I didn't quite show it the first time, but the main bearing caps are a tight register fit to the block. You have to make really sure that the saddles where it seats in are clean. Otherwise that can throw off your bearing clearance. Make sure you've got the arrow to the front also. Main bolts are lubed with engine oil on the threads and the underside of the head bolt. Now I like to get them started and then seat the cap with the mallet and then finish threading them in by hand. That's my program anyway. Okay, so now I'm going to show you how to set the thrust clearance for the number 3 bearing, which is a thrust bearing. It controls crankshaft movement front to back, basically, by having that flange bearing on the side of the main bearing saddle. What we're going to do, all main caps are snugged. We are going to loosen the bolts on the thrust bearing cap, number 3, hammer the crank backwards, hammer the crank forwards, and then the crank flange actually centers that bearing when you do that. And then we're going to torque everything, and then we'll go ahead and check the end clearance with the dial indicator and see what it is. So now those bolts are just barely snugged. Obviously, use a dead blow or a block of wood or something like that so you don't damage it. We're going to go, let's try 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 for good luck. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. All right. Okay, now they are all going to get 105 foot-pounds. You don't crank one side down and then start tightening the other side. You get them both cinched down and snugged, and then you just kind of sneak up on it a little turn at a time. Just double check them. Okay, so this is how I have the dial indicator set up. Hopefully you can see all of that. And what I'm going to do is pick a spot here to pry. We'll pry it all the way forward. And then we'll zero it. So there's all the way forward. You don't want to like crank on it. You're kind of just checking like the free float movement. Don't get your like 6 foot long pry bar and put all of your 200 pounds against it. It's overkill. So we pried it all the way forward. And now we'll jump here on the front counterweight and pry it all the way back. We got it about zeroed. And that took us to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, I believe. I'll just verify that off camera. You little... Hello! Yeah, I know you want it. Okay, so we're in the shop with Roni, aren't we?
Yeah.
What are we doing, Roni?
Building engines!
Building engines. All right. So hopefully this shows up good. We are ready to put some pistons in. So we have our budget EPW piston rings, but looking at them,
Hello!
they actually have a molly-faced top ring, so not too bad for budget stuff. Now when you open these, when you open the box, they make it easy on you. They tell you right here, top groove, second groove, third groove. So top compression ring, did you see that? Okay, watch out. Top compression, second compression, and this is the oil ring, basically assembly. There's a top ring, bottom ring, and then a spacer. So they make it easy on you. Also, they should have a dot that designates goes up. Okay, so it might be kind of hard to see, but what we're going to do is we're going to check our ring end gap. So we've got our top ring here. You can see we've got a gap at the end. And we're going to put it in the cylinder, center it up with the piston, and so we'll put it in there and we'll use a feeler gauge to determine what that gap is. Okay? I'll just show you real quick. I'll try to do this one-handed. Here's the top ring. Dot goes facing up. This is the top molly-faced ring. I've already wiped down this cylinder here. See if I can get it in there with one hand. Get it started in there. Now it's not straight, so the gap is not going to be right. Go ahead and take your piston, and I push it in there until the coated spot of the skirt about gets there. Should have it centered up pretty good. Okay, so here's a 16 thou, and you can see it slips in with just a little bit of resistance, so that is a 16 thou gap. Okay, so I've got them laid out here. 1 through 4, 5 through 8. Easy enough. This is how I measured them all. So, there is a way to roll the rings. I don't feel confident doing that. The second ring is cast iron, and I believe the top ring is cast iron with a moly kind of coating or face on it. And they're very brittle. They break very easily, so I don't feel comfortable rolling them. So I will be a chicken and use the ring spreader. But I'll show you how you roll them when I do the oil rings, because they're real flimsy. Number 6 is what I was after. Okay. So we start from the bottom and go up. The spacer ring goes on first. Easy enough. Easy enough, roll it over the top. Goes right on there. And this is how they tell you to space them. Doesn't really matter the orientation in relation to the piston because they spin when it's running. But to get it right, I don't know if you can see that there, but see where it's sticking out? That's where the gap is on that spacer ring. Line it up with the piston pin. Take one of your oil rings. These don't matter which way they go, and I'll roll these on because they're so flimsy, it's super easy. And they want you to roll the top, put the top one on first, and rolling it is like that. You just walk it down each ring groove like that, and now it's messing with me. Okay, so now I've got it on top of the spacer, and then I just gently walk it down all the way around, and it'll just snap right in there, unless your spacer's popping out like that. So the way you line them up, spacer division is here, and they want the top rail and bottom rail gaps about 1 inch apart, so an easy way for me to do it, I line up the gap in the spacer ring with the wrist pin, and then one here on this corner of this machine part of the piston, other one on this one. It's maybe a little more than 1 inch, but it's an easy quick visual way to do that. So now this guy needs to be to the opposite side of that spacer ring. Snaps right in there. And then I'm gotta find my, well, now I lost it because I probably turned it around the other side. Gotta find my gap in the spacer. Now, where'd you go, you little hoochie mama? It's kind of hard to see sometimes. Okay, there we go. The little M is where the spacer ring comes together, and the top gap is there, so I need the bottom gap right there. And it's a little too far over, so if you hold on to the top ring and poke it out and kind of take your fingernail and walk it around like that. Why you don't want them more far apart than that, I don't know. I'm not a scientist. I'm not an engine builder. I think it's because you do want a certain amount of oil to get past. So anyway, you can see top gap, bottom gap. Sorry. You can see top gap on the ring, bottom gap, spacer. Top and the compression rings, I always just put them 180 out from each other. It probably doesn't matter. I've heard if you line them up with each other, it actually won't start because you won't build enough compression. But I think once it's running, they rotate. So it doesn't really matter. Don't lose too much sleep over it. Ring spreader, dot goes to the top. Squeeze like this, and you don't want to spread it too far because they can break. Like I said, they're really brittle. So we spread it just enough to barely get over the top. And to the second ring. So that happened. That's okay, I'm comfortable with that. I'll just walk it down. Okay. And that's in. They're pretty floppy. That's what a ring compressor is for. And you have to spread them to get over the crown of the piston. That's just how it is. So that's the non-shiny sided ring, and the dot is facing up. Then the Molly faced shiny sided ring is the top ring, and that dot faces up, so we'll do that again. Make sure they're snapped in real good and that they move freely. And that is piston number 6. And this is number 1 because it's the farthest forward bank on the engine. I turn the crank so it's at the bottom of the stroke. We're going to make sure our notch is forward. Go ahead and set it down. And then when that slides off like that, she's home. This sucks, but this is why we check things. So I've got number 1 piston put in there, notches towards the front as they go. And if you come down here, the stamped number should be facing out. It's not. But so why does that matter? Well, you can see the bearing is slightly offset. There's a gap on this side. The gap should be to the outside because it goes on this little shoulder right here. And they fit it perfectly. So I'll show you. Here's the number 1 cap. You can see the stamp on there. So see that space? With it facing out, you can see that that allows room for that little shoulder right there. Now when you turn it the other way, it does not. You can feel it rubbing against that right there. So the squared off ends are for the rods to butt against each other. The chamfered end with the gap is what goes against the shoulder on the crank. So I just checked all the other ones and they're good, but this one has to go back. Everybody makes mistakes. I'll have to take it back to the machine shop and he'll have to press that pin out, flip it around, and press it back in. Okay, so piston rings are all installed, rod bearings are all loaded up in the rods, and the rods have all been cleaned and are ready to go. So hopefully what you're going to see here is a time lapse of me slamming all the pistons in the engine, checking the bearing clearance, and then final torquing them. Okay, now what we're going to do is film pistons going in this side, since I just did the whole first bank and forgot to hit record on the camera. So what we're going to do first is wipe all the cylinders down with solvent, even though they're already oiled. We want to take that oil off of there and put some fresh on there, because it's going to have dirt that has been floating around the air and has stuck to it. So we're going to put the crank journal there about the bottom of the throw. So we're going to clean all the cylinders, oil them with fresh oil, and then time to start slamming pistons in there, checking clearances, and then lube them, torque them, and then we just about have a bottom end. Yes, I sniffed it. I'm weird. I had to see which one was my solvent rag. So after your engine's been machined or your cylinders have been honed, you always want to clean the cylinder walls really, really good, because there will still be grit stuck in the crosshatch. So basically you want them to be so clean that you can wipe a clean cloth in there and it'll come out clean. So okay, so I don't like to use a rag. I really don't want to get more fuzzies on there. So what I do is kind of cup my hand in there, squirt oil, and smear it around with my glove hand with clean gloves. You want to make sure you get it everywhere. We are going to lube up the piston and the rings also, but you know, plenty of lube just never hurt anybody. I personally only use clean oil for the cylinder walls and the rings, just because I've heard stories, and maybe they're old wives' tales, about stuff like WD-40 or other kind of lubricants and rings not seating correctly. I've never had that issue, so maybe I'm just lucky. I like to tell people it's because of my skill level. That's probably not true. I'm probably just lucky, but it's better to be lucky than good, is what I heard. Okay, so we will start with number 5. Everything's nice and clean, oiled up. If I haven't said already, Fords, the farthest forward cylinder bank is always going to be number 1. And they go 1, 2, 3, 4 passenger side, 5, 6, 7, 8 on the driver's side. That is how traditional Ford pushrod V8s are numbered. So we need number 5. There we go. Then I go ahead and lube up the skirt and the rings just with clean 10W30. And that'll kind of make the rings want to stay put a little better and not slide around and pop out the side. Okay, and then notch always goes to the front. Then I'm going to reach my other hand underneath to guide this down so it doesn't gouge the crank. good if you have a partner to help you do that, but I don't. What we're gonna do is get the piston all the way flush into this ring compressor. The solid ones, you're good at that point to just go ahead and ram her home, but this one, I found that the trick is to get it flush in there and then go ahead and tighten this guy up all the way. So it's a little bit more work. So I go all the way really snug and then back it off like a quarter turn. That should be the magic. You're just massaging it. You don't really need to beat on it. I'm using the rubber butt of the hammer. And as soon as that ring compressor kind of scoots around, you are good to go. She's in there. The caps really seat down tight on the studs, so you don't hammer on them. You can just kind of wrap them like that though to get it to come free. And this one, like most of the others, is kind of ranges from 1.5 to 2 thousandths. And we're going to torque this guy back in there and we're going to check the rod side clearance, which is the clearance between this one and its companion number 1 connecting rod. Clearance between this one and the number 1 connecting rod, because they do rub together, and when stuff gets warm, it expands. And if you don't have enough clearance there, it will eat itself. And now for this torque, ARP lube on threads, which is basically a molly lube, so that we get the proper bolt stretch. And then a little bit on the flange of the nut as well. See the check mark on that one, so that means clearance has been checked and it's been torqued properly. So that way I can look at my check marks before I throw the oil pan on and get all warm and fuzzy inside. Everything gets nice and slickery when you're saucing everything up. So we turn it after every part is installed to make sure that nothing's binding, because then if all of a sudden you have a bind, then guess what? It's the part that you just installed that's causing it. Okay. Now we're going to check the side clearance real quick. I don't know what it is on a big block Ford, but we'll check it. Seems like other Ford engines, about 16 thousandths, somewhere about, is what you want. So just see if you can slip a feeler gauge in between the rods. And I cannot get a 16, so nine goes in there. Let's try 12. 12 goes in there. 13. I'm going to go with 13. No, it might be 14. Let's see. No. We'll say 13. Okay, here we go. Oh, it's cold in here. It smells like the 80s in here. Doesn't that sound just take you right back to your childhood? Ooh. That was a little rowdy there for a second. Thanks everybody for watching. Hope you enjoyed the episode. As always, if you want to see where this train wreck is headed, please like, share, tag, subscribe, ring the bell. Thanks for watching. On this episode, we salute Sergeant Kayla Marie Sullivan of the Nassau Bay Police Department. Sergeant Sullivan was murdered December 10th, 2019, while trying to arrest a fleeing domestic abuser. The suspect ran her over with his vehicle. Sergeant Sullivan served 16 years with the Nassau Bay Police Department and leaves behind a wife and a son. Sergeant Sullivan, thank you for your service.